Right. Our guest speaker today really doesn't need much of an introduction, I'm sure, to anyone who's from Adelaide, and if you're not, I'll very quickly make a couple of points. Jane Lomax-Smith's well known to pretty much everyone here as a one-time Lord Mayor of the City of Adelaide and honorary member of this club, and more recently as a minister in the Rann government, where she held, amongst others, the portfolio of education. And just as an aside, I've got a letter signed by Jane 10 years ago now, which really was one of the catalysts in getting the ball rolling that resulted in the virtual war memorial. But more recently, I've come to know, and as a consequence of an introduction from Jane, managed to build on a relationship that's been going for nearly 100 years, with a visit to Dernancourt recently, and some of our number here were on that trip. During her time as Minister, Jane became aware of the relationship that exists between the City of Adelaide and the little town of Dernancourt in northern France. Without any further ado, I'd like to invite Jane to the podium to address us as we approach the centenary of armistice with our own near centenary. Thank you, Jane.
Well, thank you. I firstly acknowledge we meet on Ghana land and say what an honour it is to be amongst Rotarians on this important week when we're all beginning to celebrate the armistice. But I suspect that, like me, even the most well-informed people in this room have learnt something over the last 4 years that this celebration and this commemoration and the events have been unfolding that you hadn't known. And I'm always amazed at my own ignorance. And one of the things that shocks me is when I find something important that's been forgotten or I have never known. And in relationship to Dernancourt, I have to say there's something very strange. It reminds me of those relationships where someone meets you and says, I remember I met you, and they tell you what you ate and what you did, and you think, God, who are they? You've got no memory. And that can happen on a very big scale. My story about Dernancourt started accidentally. I had no particular interest in the Somme, although my grandparents and great-grandparents had both, grandfathers had both, who all fought there. But in 2006, I was in cabinet, and you know what premiers do. They go around the world, they sign things, they visit people, they do deals, they come back and it's in the paper, and it's, you know, it's a standard achievement. I was sitting in cabinet in 2006. Mike Rann came back, and he was going on about the ambassador in Paris. And he was saying that when he went in to see her, she said, what are we going to do about Dernancourt? He thought, I don't know, we're going to invade it, you know, what are we going to do? And she said, I'm being driven insane by this man. There's a mayor in Dernancourt, this village, and he never leaves the embassy alone. He's been trying to get a South Australian there for 30 years. And a couple of years ago, they sent John Howard, and all they got for their thanks, and this is a photograph of John Howard on the battlefield at the cemetery at Dernancourt, was another complaint. Mr. Lamotte, the mayor of Dernancourt, said he didn't want John, well, I'm not going to say he can understand that, but he didn't want John Howard because he was not a South Australian. He wanted a South Australian. So the story was that somebody had to go, and I wasn't really listening because I certainly didn't want to go to the 90th anniversary of the Battle of the Somme. It was 3.5 weeks away, and I got a full diary. And then there was a sort of frisson of excitement around the world, around the room, and I could feel everybody getting ready for the trip. I looked up as Mike said, and you have to give 2 speeches in French. And everyone looked at me, and I knew it was me. I was pretty aggravated about this, but I took it in good stead. I wrote the speeches, and the education department had the language teachers the 4 floors below. I used to ring them every night at 5 and practice. So I felt good because I was a bit of a try-hard. I felt good when I got there. My office were completely useless. They had no idea of historical research. And as an apology, I am not a military expert. I know nothing about war battalions or anything. That's Steve, so questions to him. I'm not even a historian, I'm a pathologist, so what do I know about all this? But my office gave me this really miserable little map, and that's all I had when I went. Now, I'll draw your attention, lower left, Amiens, nicest place to go for a holiday, Villers-Bretonneux dropping off the map. Above that, Lamel, which is where the Newfoundland troops all died on the Battle of the Somme. A little higher, Dernancourt and Albert. Albert is the biggest town in the region. That's all I had. I felt really disgruntled because I had my speeches and I didn't know why I was there. I was pretty shaken when I arrived. Look at that photograph. It says Pavilion Adelaide. The school in the town says Adelaide. It's written on it. And I was, pretty stunned by this. I've got a then member of the opposition who's now a minister with me. That was the other problem. I had to go during a sitting week. I asked Mr. Lamotte about this, and he said, oh, my grandfather said I should always remember the Australians. My grandfather said I must never forget, and that's why he organised Anzac ceremonies. He also said something really peculiar, which I completely discounted with the arrogance of someone who thinks they know everything. He said it's to do with Madame Mouchette. She was a French woman who lived in Adelaide, whose husband died, and she helped raise money. I was completely convinced there was no one called Madame Mouchette. So I arrived, and I discovered this ceremony had been going on. They start at the beautiful mosaic encrusted war memorial. They occasionally get a few Australian troops, and then they walk through the town, under the railway line, up to the cemetery, the Imperial War cemeteries, which are beautifully maintained, full of Australian names, full of South Australian names, and they've been doing this every year for 30 years. Between the town and the cemetery is this. Doesn't look like that now, but that is the key part of the war battle history, which Steve will tell you about. It's the railway viaduct which carried the materials to the front. Railways were really important during the First World War, and we always walk under that. And it was only when I got back and went to the War Memorial in Canberra, I saw the diorama that shows the village of Dernancourt and the railway line and our troops, that I realised I'd stumbled across something and was seriously ignorant. Our ceremony was exactly the same, and I've been with Steve on many occasions now, and we go through the same ritual, and Monsieur Lamotte is always there. I couldn't work out what this was about, but being the Minister for Education, they insisted I go into the school, which I have to say was kind of stunning, because everywhere there were photographs of Adelaide, pictures of kangaroos, maps of South Australia, photographs of old premiers. I was completely stunned. I thought, this is really weird, because mostly, if you go abroad, people don't even know where Adelaide is, let alone having photographs of it. They took me through all their old school lessons, and I'm not sure if you can see the bit in the ring. The reason people in Dernancourt remember South Australians goes back to the start of the First World War, the 1st of August 1914, and it says in French that all the men between the ages of 20 and 48 had to leave the town to defend their motherland and go to the front. This is a farming village. And what happened was that I eventually went to the War Memorial, went through the records and discovered that in 1914 the Australians had been part of a recce, which is a good word for this, where they looked around this village and worked out that it could contain 1 brigade in billets. Within the next year there were people dying, being buried in the cemetery. And by 1916, before the start of the Battle of the Somme, 3,500 people were billeted in that town, and the majority of them were South Australians, Western Australians, and they were using the facilities in the town. The church had been turned into a hospital, and it was called Edge Hill was the local big hospital if you go to the Somme. And so our boys were there continually. So they were farming boys, they were from the country, and they were really useful. And I don't wish to talk too much about how useful they were, but one of the myths that I had not appreciated with my grandfathers was that, and in fact they didn't talk a lot about the trenches, but that's because most soldiers were not in the trenches for 4 years. It comes as a surprise to realise mostly they only stayed, a week, Steve? Sometimes they stayed 2 days. They'd go forward for an action. If they were alive or still walking, they'd come out again. They'd stay on the farms, they'd milk the cows, our lot, milking the cows, ploughing the fields, helping the farmers' wives, doing whatever was necessary, and really entrenching themselves in the community. And this was encouraged by the hierarchy because it allowed them to be well looked after, they were well fed, they stayed fit, they did their exercises, and there are paintings and lots of photographs in the War Memorial showing these relationships. And I think that is the basis of the deep bond. I'm sorry this is a rather appalling slide, but they lived there almost continually from the time they arrived in around 1915, 16, right up until the end of the war. And it was a kind of a charmed existence in a way, because they were recreating, when they weren't in the trenches, their life at home on the farms. But it all came to an end on the 26th of March, when all the troops had to withdraw, because this was the big push by the Germans. And the big push by the Germans meant they flooded over Dernancourt. Everybody, the soldiers evacuated. They went to the other side, and I'm afraid my pointer doesn't work that far, but if you can see the diagonal of the railway line, they retreated across this side of the line, the railway line, and they needed to defend two things. One was the road to Amiens, which is the line going across the top, and the other was the railway. So that next day, a whole series of Australian troops then were sent back to defend and take the railway line. You can see how the village was decimated, but this was a photograph from after the end of the war. And you can see that the part of the landscape towards the lower left was not decimated by troops, but the town on the other side was. And whilst this doesn't actually, project on such a small screen, the point of this is it's about the Bean report of the Battle of Dernancourt. It was a time that took 14 hours, this battle. It was longer than the 93 minutes that Lamel lasted. And they managed to get back across the line. And when the British troops saw them, they said, "Who are you?" And we called out 48th Australian. And they said, "Thank God, you will hold him." The Australian troops were held in good regard. By the end of the war, there was almost nothing left. The church, which I showed you the photograph of, was a shell. And then mysteriously, Mr. Lamotte showed me this photograph, and I'm not sure that you can read it. At the top left-hand corner, it says Jour d'Adelaide, the Adelaide Day. And here we have festivities, parties, people milling around, the buildings built with Adelaide. All these people are looking happy and healthy. And the thing that some of you may notice, particularly the women, is the clothes that these children are wearing. Now, we've come through a war that decimated the landscape, and I'll show you some photographs of children at the end of the war. Look at them. They've got bonnets, they've got clean clothes, they've got posh dresses. They're in front of that lovely war memorial. That was them before. Something very dramatic has happened between the end of the war, the rebuilding, and look at those clothes. I was mystified by all this. And I still had this thing about Madame Mouchette. They showed me this homework from a child, and in the circle on the right, it said in French, Madame Mouchette was the widow of an Australian soldier who was buried at Dernancourt. Well, I didn't believe that. And she raised the money at a gala at a cruise liner, at a gala event on a cruise liner. What is all this about? I couldn't make any sense of it until 3 years later. Sometimes you have to sit on your ignorance. 3 years later, I went to the Queen Adelaide Club for the 2009 centenary of the formation of the Queen Adelaide Club, and I bought a book. Not riveting reading, I'll admit, but I sat up in bed and read it that night, and there she was. That is Madame Mouchette. I was on the trail again. I was completely stunned. She really existed. Bertha Mouchette was not married to an Australian. She was married to a Frenchman. He had a bad chest. They migrated to Melbourne. She was a painter, and she was exhibited in the Salon in Paris. He died. She upped stumps and came to Adelaide. While she was in Melbourne, she started, wait for it, the Alliance Française, which even to this day has a Bertha Mouchette Prize for good French speaking. Amazing. I'd never heard of her. This is in the National Gallery of Victoria. That blood stain is an example of domestic violence ahead of its time. It's a woman who was murdered by a jealous husband, but anyway, we'll forget that. I tried really hard to work out what she was doing in Adelaide. She was teaching French. She was hobnobbing with the old Adelaide families. She was a foundation member of the Queen Adelaide Club, and she was milling around, painting and being well connected. The only painting I could find by her in South Australia is this one of a woman called Annie Besant. Now, if you're a historian about union activism, Annie Besant was an extraordinary woman. She was arrested for selling contraceptives. She left her husband because he was boring, but she was arrested for selling contraceptives. She left her 2 children, which is unusual. She then led the matchmakers' strike, the first strike that women were in England, were in the Bryant and May match factory. She then became the head of Theosophy. I can't pronounce it. It's a strange sect, and they're on South Terrace. And then she was the president of the Indian National Congress. Just figure. She's a strange woman. That's the postage stamp at the top, the Indian postage stamp. She came to Adelaide twice. Obviously, Madame Mouchette was a theosophist, and then it clicked. The packet boat was when she took the money. She took £20,000, boxes and boxes of clothes, toys and books back to Dernancourt, and she stopped in Bombay, where I suppose she met Madame Besant, Mrs. Besant. But the packet boat was actually the cruise liner she was on, where she met Nellie Melba. And she talked Nellie Melba into doing a fundraising concert, which raised more money to go back to Dernancourt. This was beginning to make my head explode, because I couldn't believe all these stories. And being an old mayor, I thought, well, it must be something to do with the town hall. So I worked out, if you were raising money in Adelaide, where would you get it from? And I think you get it from Walkerville and Adelaide. So we tracked through the archive. Well, you know. We went through the archives and we found the letters and the fundraising meetings. And I found this lady was invited as the Lady Mayoress to be the fundraiser, and her husband didn't want her to do it. He seemed a bit mean-spirited. He was a bit cross. He wasn't in the war, but eventually for his services to the French rebuilding, he got a Légion d'honneur, which is, you know, made me a bit cross. But anyway, she was extraordinary, and I have to tell you that I became fascinated by Deborah Hackett. She was the daughter of Grace Bussell, who was the hero, if you're Western Australian, of some disaster. But she grew up with Aboriginal kids. She ran feral in the country. She ran away from home at 17 to marry a man who was 40 years older than her, called Hackett, and he was a multi-millionaire. They had 5 children. He died. Then she went skiing and met Frank Molden, who was going to be the mayor of Adelaide, and he was only 20 years older than her, so she was... When he died, she married someone who was 10 years younger. She was learning. Hackett was fascinating because he gave £500,000 to the Western Australian University when it only cost $7,000 a year to run it. And I went around the university looking for traces of her, and I found this portrait. Isn't she glorious? She's grown up a lot since the last one. Now, for those of you who are military historians, there will be 2 things on this picked slide that will make you excited. One is General Sir John Hackett was the donor, that was her son. And the other one was, it's painted by Will Longstaff. Now, if you know anything about the stuff in the War Memorial, you'd know this painting. It's Midnight at the Menin Gate with all the ghostly outlines walking through the gate. He'd never painted portraits, but I suspect that Lady Hackett wouldn't let him off the hook. And she got that portrait. The son is wonderfully exciting. He was the commander-in-chief on the Rhine during the Second World War and was a bit of a politician. He had a degree from Oxford. He was into the arts. And there were 4 other sisters who were all equally exotic, particularly Patricia, who lived with Dr. McCatter in the old sanitarium building, if you're from Adelaide and know that. So he had arranged the portrait. How did we get to Dernancourt then from all this? Well, I was struggling to work out why on earth Dernancourt was called Dernancourt, but I did tell you in my quick run-through that it was an important battle. There was a Victoria Cross, there were DCMs and all sorts of medals in the hour, in the 14 hours that it was played out. And Leslie Hobby got a military medal. Now, Leslie Hobby had a cousin who was a developer who bought the hundreds at Yatala, as it was called, and used the campaigning, because it was in literally all the newspapers at the time were going on about Dernancourt. We have adopted this town, they have saved our boys, they fed us, they looked after us. It was in the paper constantly, and he was just a clever marketer. He leapt on the back of the hysteria about Dernancourt and the fundraising. He subdivided the suburb and called it Dernancourt. That's why Dernancourt's there. And if you come from Walkerville, because I got this from the Walkerville Historical Society, then Chester Hobby is the grandson of Leslie's brother, and the Crouches are also relatives. So if there are any Crouches or Hobbys, okay. I'm so relieved there are no Moldens, because I always say rude things about Frank Molden, and I feel a bit embarrassed about it. So he got his military medal. That was the only photograph I've got of him. And this has been a 20-minute whiz around Dernancourt, and I've come across Deborah Hackett, who I'll just tell you one more thing about. She was a great mining investor, and I know there are some people who are geological engineers or engineers here. Her other famous activity was that she bought up the entire tantalite supply in Australia. She was fascinated by mining. She bought a lot of tenements. She bought cinema complexes, but particularly mining tenements. And she cornered the market in tantalite ahead of the discovery that it was the key ingredient for making radar. And so during the Second World War, all of her tantalite was compulsorily acquired by the government. And she was so cross because she said she'd won the war. She sued them and she won. She got a £500,000 settlement back from the Commonwealth government because they had taken her tantalite without funding it. Frank Molden, well, I won't say more about Frank. Bertha Mouchette, Nellie Melba, Annie Besant. Roma Mitchell is attached to Dernancourt. Her father died on the first day of the Battle of Dernancourt. And although no recent dignitaries have been there, she made 2 private visits to see her father's grave. Thomas Playford was in one of those battalions that was fighting in that area. And the other name that's interesting, I think the only premier that has actually been there would be Henry Barwell, who went again with more money. He was the Agent General in London, which a job he'd retired to after being the premier. So all these links, but there are all these holes as well, these things I don't know. So really, we need to keep digging around here. I brought Monsieur Lamotte to Adelaide because I thought he couldn't believe we had an Anzac ceremony that was so big and so well attended. We've tried to keep the relationship going. We've got student groups to go out under the spirit of Anzac. Dame Romo had died by the time this all eventuated, but I had her best friend, who was Kemery Murray, meet Monsieur Lamotte, and they talked about Dernancourt. And I pulled together people from the Queen Adelaide Club, the Walkerville Historical Society, and anybody I could find to try and keep this relationship alive. So what do I ask you? I've spoken, and that's been very nice, but I have to say, if you have any grandparents or any relatives, or you buy a house, or you're clearing the loft, or you're going through a shed, please look out for rosettes and badges saying Dernancourt, because they may be 100 years old, and they may be the things that the ladies in Walkerville were selling, that were being sold at the ball that was held at the Hawker's property, and that were being sold at the fundraisers in Adelaide, and I've never seen one. Please look out for it, and please don't throw anything away without sifting through it.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's probably incited more questions than perhaps it answered, but we'll just open the floor for a few questions if anyone has one. Right. We've left everyone in stunned silence.
I'm sorry.
We have got one over the back there. Stephen.
Actually, not a question about Dernancourt, but I happened to be at a presentation last week regarding Sir Hubert Wilkins, and I saw his photograph historical recounts in the War Museum in Canberra about 3 weeks ago. I know that you were at that presentation again, so again, it's along that theme of some fairly significant South Australian involvement in that First World War. And I don't know if you want to comment about that, but I think this link to Dernancourt is something I didn't know about, other than the name of the suburb here, but I didn't understand that. So it was an excellent presentation. I thank you. If you'd like to make some comment about Sir Hubert Wilkins. No, Robin Turner's not here. He would be very pleased I actually raised it. No, thank you.
Well, I suspect everyone knows about Sir Hubert Wilkins, do you? He's one of the 3 polar explorers from South Australia, from Mount Rann, and went under the poles and flew in the air. And I recommend the book Simon Nashed, The Last Explorer, boys' own adventure stuff.
Pardon me. He was also the first owner of the aircraft to become known as the Southern Cross. So there you go. Pardon me. Down the back there. David.
It may be of some interest to you that my daughter lives in Medindie in a house once owned by Arnold Malden, who ran a legal practice here in Adelaide in Grenville Street many, many years ago. I'll get her to dig the garden and see if she can find something.
As a sort of, I guess, postscript to this, before I took the recent Battlefield Tour group away, I did contact Jane, and she introduced me to Lionel Lamott. And I indicated to him that we would be coming over, and to say that he was very pleased would be an understatement. And he had this rather extravagant program worked up for us, and I had to sort of delicately extract ourselves. We spent a morning there, and we did visit Dame Roma's grave. And we also, I'd mentioned it to the town hall because of the connection, and Martin Hazy said 2 things. Here's a letter and some gifts for the mayor, and Dame Roma was my godmother, which I did not know. But what we did then do, I took a pipes and drums band back some 2 weeks later, and it's fair to say that they've got a pretty strong recollection now, at least for the time being, of South Australia and South Australians. The pipes and drums came from New South Wales, but I didn't tell them that.
So I'm on a bit of a mission to stop people lionising Villers-Bretonneux, because the reality is that as South Australians, we should be thinking about the places where our boys fought and died, and I think Dernancourt's the place that people should visit and remember. So I get really upset. I mean, I love Villers-Bretonneux, I love Thiepval, Lamel, all these places are wonderful to visit. But if you are on a South Australian mission, you go to Dernancourt.
So, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of everybody here, I'd like to thank Jane for a wonderful address, and certainly a different slant on the centenary of Armistice, and perhaps a more positive one, because it was about rebuilding rather than knocking things down. So we'd like you to accept this token of our appreciation,
Thank you.
which is our very high quality pen.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you very much indeed.